Hello, welcome to episode 14 of A Lesson Before Writing. I'm Ted Morrissey, and I'm here with my co hosts, Grant Tracy. And this is Grant's most recent book that we've published, a Hayden Fuller novel, Neon Kiss. But Grant has just sent me the manuscript for his fifth Hayden Fuller novel. So maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that during this episode. And then also here with Brady Harrison, who is the author of The Term Between, winner of the High Plains Book Award. But I know one of the things we're definitely going to talk about is Brady's new book, which we are in the throes of getting ready for publication. But meanwhile, I'll just plug myself. This is my most recent book in paperback, The Strophes of Job. And it is the prequel to Crow's Song for the Stricken, which I redid the cover and got a hold of a few copies. The fine folks at Chicago Public Library Albany Park branch have invited me to do a reading September 19th from the Strophes of Job, and I'm super excited about that. I just almost never get a chance to read to a live audience, and I just love to do it. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then the fine folks at Kirkus, they've been pretty good to me. They gave Crow Song, the original book, a starred review, and then named it a best indie book of 2017. And then the prequel to Crow Songs, The Strophes of Job, which just came out in January. Like I said, the paperback is just out recently. They gave a nice review and recommended it. And then also featured it in the July print edition of the magazine. So that was all very cool. So just a lot of stuff going on. Last episode I kind of hit you guys with a question you weren't prepared for about what's gone on the past year, and has it changed your perspective? And I know I'm always feeling like I'm like way behind on what I want to be doing. I'm not getting nearly enough done, and I'm just being a real lazy dog. But then I take a deep breath and I think back over the last year or so, and I realized, oh my gosh, I wrote, X amount, and I published this, and I published, books of others, and this, that, and the other. And then I start thinking, yeah, maybe I did okay. I don't know, do you guys ever have that that feeling of you're just not getting enough done and you're moving too slowly, or are you pretty satisfied with your productivity? Grant, let me kick it over to you since you just sent me your fifth Hayden Fuller manuscript last night. Or do you feel like you're being pretty productive, or what?
Well, I'm embarrassed to admit this, but part of my neuroses is if I don't have anything in the pipeline, I start to freak out. It's just how I've been for 30 years now. Oh, 14. Yeah, 30 years as a professor. And so even though I know A Shoe Shine Kill is in the pipeline, it's like everything else that I'd sent out, but either been rejected or accepted. I got a couple of things floating around, but I don't have anything getting ready to come out. And so I start getting grumpy and anxious. So it's a proactive thing I got to do just to feel good about myself, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I've had a very productive year in terms of publishing stuff, but it's never quite enough. I don't know. It's embarrassing to admit that, but that's how I roll.
Yeah, yeah. Brady, how are you? How's your self-esteem in the productivity department?
Oh, self-esteem, yeah, very low. And I understand completely, Grant, what you're saying, and Ted, how you opened this. I have two books coming out this year. One I expect to get in the mail, the Dylan book that I co-edited with our buddy Barry Falk. And I think we're getting pretty close, Ted, on the novel. And yet I feel like I'm not doing anything. And I'm writing. I'm working on new projects. I'm revising works in progress. And yet, just like Grant, like it just doesn't feel like I'm doing anything. And in the back of my mind, I want to get doing more. I've got all these ideas that I want to realize, that I want to see if I can make them any good, realize them. And yeah, where did the days go? So when the novel comes out, A Journey to El Romal, that'll be book number 10. So forgive me for saying that. like that seems like, that's pretty, reasonable amount of work. And yet I just feel like I'm always just getting started, and I just can't wait to get to the next thing. So yeah, I'm plagued by it.
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe that's a good thing in general because it does kind of keep us moving, keep producing and so forth. Yeah, I'm the same way, Grant. Right now, I don't have any accepted pieces that are, going to be coming out. I had a couple of sci-fi pieces come out in the last couple of months, but yeah, unless something's been accepted, and I can say, well, that's going to be out in a month or 6 months or whatever. There's a part of me at least that feels like, oh no, what's going on here. And I do have a few pieces out, but they're long and they're excerpts from this novel I'm working on, so they're not very self-contained. So I know it's kind of a long shot for them to get picked up, but largely because of the length. And I thought about cutting them down, quite honestly, because I could easily do that. But I thought, shush. I'll just keep sending them out at 7,000, 7,500 words or whatever. And, we'll see what happens, see if somebody bites on them or whatever. But yeah, Brady mentioned A Journey to Al Ramel. That's his novel, which, if you've been a follower of our podcast, it's something we've been talking about now for over a year as coming out. It just takes a while to get things together, but we're getting close. And so I've sent a couple rounds of proofs to Brady, and he's edited them and made corrections and sent them back. So earlier this week, he and I got together via Zoom and went over the manuscript. And we thought the proof pages, I should say, and we thought we might at least start off by talking a little bit about that. I actually thought about recording that Zoom session just in case it was interesting. It's probably just as well in retrospect that I didn't. Hopefully we can make it interesting now, though, because one of the things that we are really struggling with is Brady's doing all this really interesting stuff in his original manuscript, A Journey to Al Ramel, where he's got a bunch of embedded text and he's doing these really interesting things with graphic representations using text, and it's very, very complicated. But what I was running into as the layout guy is that when we do that originally in a manuscript, we're working in a field of 8.5 by 11. The standard manuscript page. Obviously, we're not going edge to edge, but still we've got a pretty large space. So if we embed text and we do some things, there's plenty of room there. But I'm trying to squeeze it into my kind of usual format, and I've kind of developed this size I really like working with, and it's 3.85 inches across and 7 inches deep. And so when you take a 8.5 by 11 page and try to squeeze it into this, just the laws of physics get in the way, and it's really hard to make it come together in the way that it was in the original manuscript. And we really have been struggling with that. I've run into that with my own work because I like that experimental kind of stuff too, but I've just had to give it up, And I don't know, Brady, what are your kind of thoughts? You've had a few days now to kind of come to terms with it. I know you've decided just to try to simplify the text on the page, or the look of the text on the page. What are some of your thoughts a few days hence?
Well, yeah, indeed. My first thought is I'm getting on my publisher's last nerve with it's like who is the crazy man that wrote this strange text? So I love, of course, as we all do, different genres, and I love writers who mix different genres together in one book. Like I can't tell a straightforward story, with a narrative voice and a perspective. Like my brain doesn't work that way. I'm kind of always hopping around, and I love the book. I love books as objects. One of my favorite writers, Lawrence Stern, he's deeply interested in how it looked and what you could do on the page. And so in the original in the ongoing versions of A Journey to Al Ramel, there were parallel texts. But as Ted said, and as Ted has struggled with, what you can do in 8.5 by 11 does not shrink down well. And so, yeah, had to come up with other ways. And I'm actually really happy with the solutions that we've come up with, particularly after we talked. And so I don't feel like I've lost anything, but I am, and I think some things have gained, but I think that those original conceptions and the kinds of pressures and the kinds of ways that those parallel texts and inserted texts, and we even experimented with verbal descriptions of photographs framed as if they were photographs inserted into the text. And so those establish a kind of relationship with the reader and put certain kinds of pressure on the reader. And so some of that pressure has been taken off, but I'm still really interested in the book as object and what the page can look like. And I guess that's a shout out to Davenport and my other poetry buddies who, I mean, poetry is a form that depends a lot on how it looks on the page. So yeah, I'm still interested. I still love Lawrence Stern, and apparently William Gass also struggled with these things. So I feel like I'm in good company. But yeah, I'm delighted with the solutions we've come up with.
Cool, cool. Well, I'll come back to some of that, but let me get Grant in here. Now, Grant, you're not one to be quite that experimental with text on the page,
No.
but you and I talked a couple days ago on the phone about some other stuff and got into the fact that North American Review, the journal you've been editing now for quite a while, has a little bit bigger format. And then what is it? Not too long ago, you went to an even bigger format.
Yeah,
And that obviously impacts how you can represent text on the page. You want to talk about some of
sure.
those decisions and some of the aftermath of that?
Yeah. When I started on the magazine in 2000, it was 8.5 by 11, and very much like New York City on a grid. You fly into New York and you can just see all the lines to the city from the sky, and it's wonderfully made out. Whereas here in Waterloo and Cedar Falls, because of the river and the way it flows through the two towns, our streets go like that. It's weird. It's not on a grid, but yeah. So originally the magazine, at least when I started, everything, like, we always had to end at the end of a column. So fiction was 2 columns with art. And so we couldn't have white space at the end. So I always had to I used to do layout back then. I don't do layout anymore, but I used to do the layout back then with Vince Cotera. And with working on the layout, we would assign we would already know the length of the story, and then we would assign the art, like, is it going to be this big, this big, this big, so that the end of the story would end at the end of the column, of the second column. And then there'd be a little zap dingbat thing there. But that was a pain. And then poetry, blank page. And obviously we had to be aware of the gutter. And then creative nonfiction were 3 columns. Same rules apply. But then with creative nonfiction is, where do you put the hyphens? And you don't want to break up so many words, at the syllables of like two words, and then have it going into the next column. So we had to set that right. So that was a lovable pain, but it was a pain. And then we've got with the new look, I think it's much more friendly to poets, because we can have really long lines because of the wider format. Like in some of those 6x9 magazines, you have to turn it this way if you're a Walt Whitman poet, so the line, if you don't want to break the line, and we don't need to do that because we got the space for it. The other fun thing that Jeremy does, because he does the layout, Jeremy Schraffenberger, is he can mess with the font size. So a story could be a couple columns, and it could be a single column. It could be a wider column. He lets the art bleed across the page, so it's not just on one page. And we have color art now, so it's just way more exciting. We don't worry about white space. White space is our friend. So if a story has this much, it doesn't matter. It's nice. It's liberating to be free of the grid, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And Jeremy's just done some really creative things. So if you haven't checked out the latest North American Review, product placement here, I strongly recommend that you get a copy. But it looks really sharp. And I think something about when we did the reboot redesign, we've been getting some really great work from people. Not that we didn't get it before, but I feel the level of work's gone up. So we got BuzzFeed did a little buzz about us, and some other places listed the when we first did. I think the reboot was if I have my dates right, was in conjunction with 2015, which would have been the 200th anniversary. And the magazine started in 1815, then went on hiatus for a few years during World War II, then came back at Cornell College in Iowa until about 68. And then it came to UNI in 68. UNI did a name change. We used to be Iowa State Teachers College. And then we, wanted to be more upscale, so the provost wanted to get something. We had this opportunity to get the magazine. And so North American Review came to UNI in 1968, and it's been here ever since. But yeah, I love the new format. It's just, like I said, liberating, and it's so much fun.
Well, I not that it matters, but I think the format change was a couple of years after the two, because you had a bicentennial conference, and
Right.
then a couple of years later you had like a writing conference. But part of that, I think, was unveiling the new
Yes,
version.
you're right. It was the 50 years at UNI conference. So we
Okay.
had the 2015, the bicentennial, then we had, like, I think 2017 or 2018, the 50 years, and that's when we unveiled the New Look magazine. Yes,
Yeah,
correct.
that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let me. I want to get to Brady, but let me just real quickly, since I'm kind of thinking of it. You said that you've been getting even better submissions, you think, since you kind of rebooted the format.
Yeah.
Do you feel like it's affected your selection of material? Would you select material now that maybe you would have passed on because the formatting would have been
Wow.
more challenging, or is that even in your mind as you're looking at material?
It's not in my mind, but that's a good question. I mean, I'm trying to be totally honest here. I know in the past there was stuff I rejected because I just thought there's no way we can lay this out on the page. I can't make this work. But that's never crossed my mind recently since especially given we're doing more stuff with graphics than we did before. And so yeah, that's a great question. And I would say no. I mean, no, in other words, yes, I will take a variety of things that maybe I wouldn't take before. And I don't say no to stuff. If I like it, I like it. And I'm going to find a way to make it work. Whereas in the past, like, for example, if this sounds so weird, but if it was, because we had this drop cap thing, and if the first sentence was really super short, then you'd have this space, and you'd have to, it was a nightmare, trying to get the second paragraph to start and with the drop cap. And we don't have that problem anymore. So yeah, I don't think about it anymore. I'd like to say I didn't think about it before, but I did. That would be lying, but I really don't think about it. It's just the quality of the work. And the other thing is, that's going to sound weird, but I have taken longer stories since we've got the new format. It's easier on the eyes.
Hmm.
Because we can alternate the fonts and the size, shape. When it was on a 2-column grid, if you had, let's say, a 10,000 word story, not only does it take up a ton of pages in the magazine, but we went to pull quotes to try to give this was back in the day, pull quotes to kind of break the words so that there's some white space, because we needed to make it breathe, because in the granite grid, it didn't breathe. And so that was one of the things we did, was we brought in pull quotes, in the early 2000s. But now, because of what Jeremy can do with the page and on the page, I feel more inclined to take, as you were saying earlier, Ted, this 7,000 to 7,500, word stories, and not be afraid of them, because it might be taxing on the reader, to, especially longer essays in that 3-column format were a nightmare. But now the essays are treated like the fiction, and they're given imagery, and they look great. Whereas in the past, I think the CNF was a little bit, given a little bit of second-class status, which I don't think is fair. So I think we're doing a much better job of being inclusive of all genres and treating them all equally and respectfully.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Brady had invoked the name of my my idol, William Gass, because he and I talked about that a little bit during our editorial meeting the other day. I would normally point to Gass's picture on this shoulder, but I'm in an alternate location. I still feel the urge to point to the spirit of William H. Gass. But I brought it up because Gass, he was an experimentalist, and especially earlier in his career, and one of the most graphically experimental things that he did was this little novella called Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife, which came out in 1968 as a supplement to Tri-Quarterly magazine, and eventually Knopf, published it as a hardcover edition and so forth. But it's wildly, layout-wise, just wildly experimental. And he's got the multiple texts going on the page, as Brady was kind of doing. And now I love it, of course, and in fact, the opening quote when you go to 12winters.com on the landing page is a quote from Gass, and it's from Willie Masters' Lonesome Wife. But Gass always said that he felt it was kind of a failure, that he was trying to do a bunch of stuff, and he was trying to do it for artistic reasons, to have like an emotional impact or something. But in retrospect, he thought, it was just kind of a gimmick. A lot of it was just, it didn't really have much bearing on the quality of the reading experience or whatever. And so Brady and I talked about that a little bit. So I don't know, Brady, now that you're making some of these changes to the pages and are okay with them, what are some of your, like, in thinking back to your process, I mean, what were some of your hopes in terms of some of the kind of wildly experimental stuff you were doing with text on the page? What was your game plan with all that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it depended on the particular moment in the narrative. I mean, there's a Journey to Al Ramel has a narrative. There's a narrative structure. There's a protagonist undertaking a journey to get from A to B, from Paris to Al Ramel. So there's a story there. There are characters, but in different situations in the text, the inserted text, I wanted, in some cases, a sense of dislocation. There's a certain confusion that comes with sort of introducing different narrative elements. Other stories emerge in the main story, the overall narrative arc. There are intrusive stories, and I wanted those intrusive stories to have their own intrusive moments. And so I wanted the reader to have some sense of dislocation by times, and some hopefully sense of wonderment, as opposed to just sheer confusion and discouragement. That what is going on? What is motivating these characters? What are their experiences? Why are they the way that they are? And so in graphic ways, I was hoping in the original drafts, the many thousand drafts of the novel, to try to create that experience in the reader, in part through this graphic sense. And so in the parallel narratives, for example, there would be whatever the main narrative is doing, but then there would be something else going on the side that was in some kind of tension or relationship with the overall narrative. But it would be up to the reader to puzzle that through, if they wanted, if they accepted the challenge, or they became, they wanted to think through how these different parts go together. And so in the reformatting, I don't think those things are lost, but there was a certain kind of psychological tension I was hoping for in some of the graphics. So yeah, I get Gass's thing. Like, is it just a gimmick? Is it just because we're curious what can happen on the page? So my thinking all along has been, it's been trying to get at these characters' experiences, and where do they come from, and what is their state of mind, and what forces or energies are tick-tocking in them as they go along. And so trying to capture that not only in narrative, but in the sheer graphicness of it. But like I said earlier, I like our solutions because I don't think they were lost. I think some of that dislocation and that pressure, and trying to duplicate the pressure that's in these characters' minds, I think that we've been able to retain that. I don't know, Ted, did I even answer your question, or am I just nattering? I'm nattering.
No, you did. And I've been sitting here thinking about Crowsong for the Stricken, because when I wrote that book, and this came out it came out in 2017, but I actually finished writing it in 2015. But one of the stories was accepted by Southern Humanities Review, and it was going to appear in their 50th anniversary issue. So I literally waited 2 years to publish this book just so I could give them first rights to that story. But I think the literary world has survived that delay. But one of the experiments that I did in this, there's this episode called Season of Reaping, and in my original concept, I know only people on video can see this, but I wrote this story, this thing, and I deliberately made the text of the story, the narrative, very journalistic, very straightforward. Not a lot of poetic flourish. Well, no poetic flourishes to speak of. But what I did was originally I wrote these villanelles to go along with the story. And those, my experience was I'm going to embed those in the text, and the emotional impact that, if there is one in the story, will come from the villanelles, but the story itself will be kind of like a gray wall with a hopefully really interesting painting on it. That was the impact I was going for. And it did originally get published online, and they were able to do what I had in mind, which originally was the text of the story, and then the villanelle was kind of embedded in here. But when I went to do the layout in book form, there was just no way. I ran into the same problem that Brady and I were talking about the other day. So I just interrupt the text and stick the villanelle on a page by itself. And so the text is interrupted here and then continues, so there's an interruption. And I don't know if it's any different than if the villanelle had been, embedded in the text, or just to have it on a separate page. But yeah, those are considerations. I've toned down my textual experimentation in recent years, and I haven't thought about it in this way, but maybe it's an anticipation of knowing that eventually it's going to be in book form, and I'm not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z visually. So why start off there? And I guess, and again, I'm just kind of thinking through this now, but I've started using some of my own art in my books. Like The Artist Spoke, which is set in Chicago, I've included my photography of the city, and it doesn't really quite go with the text. It almost tells kind of a different story. And then with Strophes, I made these weird pebble portrait things and embedded them, put those in the text. And so I wonder if part of what I'm doing is because I don't feel like I can be as experimental with the text if I'm starting to play with graphic elements, because those are much easier just to insert into the text. Brady, you're an artist also. The term between features one of your paintings on the cover. Have you been interested in trying to get like some of your own artwork into your stories and novels? To date, I don't think I've seen that.
Yeah. No, I'm not going to inflict. I'm no artist, and I'm not going to inflict. And I'm not saying that that's what you're doing. I love the photographs, and yeah, I'm gonna say no. Like there's a kind of limit, and so what I'm really saying is don't encourage me, Ted, because who knows what you'll get next. But I'm going to kick this over to Grant, because Grant had this great idea and this great experience, and we were talking about it a few podcasts ago, of line drawings and images to go along with the hard boiled genre. And just the other day, I was been shifting books around, kind of easing towards retirement, and bringing some books home from my office and all that kind of thing. So I was moving some books around, and I tripped across some Hardy Boy novels that I must have been toting around since I was a kid. Like, why am I still toting those around? But they had these great line drawings in them. And I love those, and I love the cover images of books. And I didn't know, Ted, that you did the cover for Strophes. I mean, it's so striking. I was wondering where you got that image from. So yeah, so let me pass the baton over to Grant. Back to the images.
Yeah, I would love like this. I've got a collection of Eddie Sands stories called Winsome Murders, because there's so much murder that goes on in Winsome. It's like a Wild West town in upstate New York. But I visualize it as, I would love those Black Mask kind of, or the shadow, those pulp pages with violence and all that cool stuff, like gunshot, a body, a gun and a flame coming out of it almost, like those cool, like, because I love comic books. And so for me, there's like that moment in pulp that can be kind of comic booky and super, super cool. And the books you were talking about, Brady, I recently have been because I wasn't much of a reader till I was 15. I got to be honest. I remember consciously deciding one summer that I wanted to be a writer. And to be a writer, you need to be a reader. And I spent the whole summer sitting on the back porch to our small house in Norwood, Ontario, after we moved from Toronto. And I read like 40 books that summer. And I was reading every day and tending to my dad's garden. I had to pick weeds every day. That was but I didn't have to work. So, but I just love the idea of visuals to go with storytelling. And so I got all these kid books I've started to read now. And I've been reading the Mike Mars series. He's this astronaut, this young kid, and it's got great visuals. And do you remember, I don't know if you remember this, but when we were in high school, or maybe it was even middle school, or junior high in my era, there was an H.G. Wells reconception of War of the Worlds with wonderful graphic art by oh God, I can't remember the cat's name. He's a New York artist, and they're just these little visuals at the start of chapters and the ends of chapters, and they're creepy and incredible. And I bought a kind of a remake of that book by NYRB Books, New York Review of Books, and it's actually, I didn't buy it. A buddy of mine, Mitch Strauss, gave it to me for my birthday, and it is a much cherished heirloom in my collection. But the Mike Mars stuff, I've been reading the Chip Hilton books by Claire B. I've been reading. Yeah, I've been kind of getting into these. I like sports genres, so we're reading some of these sports books, and they got graphics everywhere, cool little images that work in conjunction with the story and are a lot of fun. And kind of they work almost like a pull quote. They give you a little snapshot of something that you've either just read or is going to be coming up, and so it's really cool.
Well, that kind of made me think about the fact that when I published my little novella, which is a revisionist work of Melville's Typee. Mine is called Weeping with an Ancient God. I wanted to have another sort of text running through it, but I wasn't feeling particularly confident yet in my artistic ability. But at the time, I was between marriages, so I was kind of hanging out in the bohemian culture of my town and hanging out with a lot of artists. And there was this artist named Adam Perschbacher, who I really liked his work. And so I asked Adam, probably after about 10 beers each, if he would want to do some artwork for this little novella. And so he agreed. I'm not sure he would have like 2 beers earlier, but he agreed at that point. And so anyway, he ended up doing these really cool drawings for Weeping with an Ancient God. And that book came out in 2014. I really can't quite remember. I know I just kind of gave him free rein. I just kind of gave him the manuscript. Maybe I told him, shoot for about 6 illustrations or something. I don't remember, but cool stuff. But a couple of the illustrations actually contradict the text. I don't know if he maybe just didn't read it as carefully or what, or maybe he was maybe it was passive aggressive editing on his part, trying to encourage me to change the text or something. But anyway, I left the text and left his drawing because I liked it. I liked the fact that his drawings weren't exactly, hand in glove with what was happening in the scene that he was illustrating. And they reminded me that when Thackeray, William Makepeace Thackeray, he did all the line drawings for his mega novel Vanity Fair. And oftentimes the drawings contradict what's going on in the text of the story. So he didn't even seem to care. It was like he worked as an artist and he worked as the writer. And the fact that they didn't quite mesh was fine with him. And so I kind of took that attitude toward this artwork that Adam had come up with. And like I said, when I did The Artist Spoke then, I didn't worry about coming up with photographs that seemed to really nicely dovetail with what was going on in the story. I wanted them just to sort of create kind of their own, feel their own tone, that went along with the story, but didn't necessarily illustrate specific scenes or whatever. So that's kind of in contradiction a little bit to Grant, what you've been talking about in terms of line drawings that clearly are based on episodes in whatever it might be or whatever. I know Grant, you guys have a lot of graphics for North American Review, especially in this new format. And oftentimes the connection between the artwork and the narrative are not not crystal clear. There's kind of an abstract connection.
Right.
How does all that kind of get into the mix?
That's Emily Stowe is our art editor for the interior pages, and she reads each story super carefully. She writes a whole synopsis, like a paragraph like this, to send to the artist, so the artist will know what the story is about or the CNF is about, and then make the art. But there are other times several times where she just finds an art piece that's kind of got something to do with this in an abstract way. And it doesn't, when I first started, I wanted the art to be exactly what I was saying a few minutes ago. But as time went on, working with Roy Behrens, I came to realize you could do a more abstract kind of quality, and it sort of gets to some of the themes. Oh, that's like the hair. Oh, that's like this. Or there's this word that keeps showing up, or it's an image of water and there's a scene with water, driftwood, it doesn't need to be a one-to-one correlation. So that's a great point. And I'll tell you something else. We cheat a little bit sometimes on pull quotes, because pull quotes are supposed to be kind of a harbinger of things to come or what we just read. But sometimes we actually will, and no writers complained so far, but we will shorten the quote, make it maybe a little more dramatic, given, due to space constraints. So like we want something sexy, something that'll grab the reader. And this sentence is wonderful, but it's a little long, but I really want this sentence. And so we'll do a little truncation. So feel a little guilty saying that, but yeah, we play a little fast and loose with pull quotes, is what I'm trying to say.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that kind of reflects to your question. But when I first started, you don't mess with pull quotes, and you don't create art that's abstract. But as time's gone on, I let Emily do her thing, and she's wonderful. She's incredibly on top of it and comes up with great art for the magazine. And she's now got connections all over the US and the world. People want to get in our magazine. We don't pay a whole lot to artists. Artists are like musicians. You got to pay them, like us writers, we, give me my 2 copies, I'm happy. But artists, they want their pay. And, the scale we give is not that high. We've been trying to get grants to give more money to the artists, because we realize that's sort of the norm in the profession. But they seem to like to work with us and like the quality of what we're doing. So hopefully that will continue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Brady, I was thinking here, I know you don't teach in Missoula's MFA program, but obviously you rub elbows with a lot of those people at the water fountain. And, one of the things I've always kind of objected to in terms of the bureaucratization of the arts is trying to force people into particular lanes. Like, okay, you've got to be a fiction writer, so that's all you're gonna focus on as you're working on your MFA or whatever, or you're going to be this, you're going to be that. And I always felt like that's a real injustice, that if people have multiple interests, they really ought to be encouraged to pursue these different things. One of my favorite writers is a woman named Shelley Jackson, and she talks about this in interviews, where when she was coming along, she loved art. She loved writing. She was one of the pioneers of computer programming, and so she loved programming. And people were always forcing her to try to make a choice. What are you going to do? And she kept pushing back against that, and that's led to her creating really interesting, work over the years. It's sort of a hybrid of all these different interests that she has. Do you pick up on that vibe at all, Brady, at Missoula, in terms of trying to force students particularly into particular lanes, or is it much more open about, maybe mixing talents and so forth?
Yeah. Yeah, great questions. Also, I want to be a little political. I would say that in my experience, people occupy their lanes pretty clearly, and they seem to stay in their lanes. And I certainly was that way myself, that although I had an interest, of course, because I teach fiction, teach courses on the novel and the novella and the short story, but also had an interest in writing them. But that's not what I was hired for, and that's not what I was doing. And so there were the writers, and then there are the scholars, and there are the teacher education folks, and so everybody had their lane. But a sort of transformative experience for me came when I was writing an article on one of my scholarly and literary heroes, Leslie Fiedler. And most people don't know this. Leslie Fiedler, of course, very famous in American letters, but he actually wrote most of his famous works while he was a professor at the University of Montana, where I work. Like, no one knows that. Like, everyone thinks that he's sort of this East Coast guy. He's not. It was then when the university was called in those days, Montana State University. Leslie Fiedler was in the same hallways. And so I was reading this, an essay that he'd written, an introduction to one of his works. And he said that he saw no difference between writing about fiction, the scholarly enterprise, or writing fiction, that it was all part of the life of the mind and the joy that we take in words and stories. And so he saw no difference in having those diverse practices. And when I read that, it's kind of like, wow, I can do that. I don't have to stay in my lane. I can do whatever I want. And so Ted has made reference to the painting. There are some things that one does at home you should, kind of keep mum about. One of them is the painting. But it's so liberating, I think, to, if you have those interests, to follow your interests wherever they go, including doing line drawings and including one's photographs. I mean, if it's good enough for Zabald, it's good enough for us, right? To include those images. So yeah, I like those folks that aren't in just one lane. As I think all of us, we've all had many experiences. We're all both scholars and writers and photographers and whatever else we get up to. So I think that's great.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think that's why tenure is important. I think about my mentor, Bob Carringer, rest his soul. He was a Ben Franklin scholar, and he was able to, even within our disciplines, even at a research one place, you can shift lanes, like maybe not go to creative writing, but he became one of the great preeminent film scholars in North America, doing really exhaustive work on Orson Welles, on Magnificent Ambersons and Citizen Kane, and then later on Los Angeles and as locales for films and stuff. So Nina Baim was who my wife worked with, was a Hawthorne scholar, and then she became, women writers of the 19th century, and carved out a niche there. And so once you get tenure, it's like, I think especially at Research One schools, your portfolio can shift and you can do a lot of whatever it is that grabs you that you want to do. In my case, coming to a small school with a directional in front of its name, I was always told that you are a member of the English department, not the Film Society. In other words, I could do whatever I wanted as long as I was doing something, getting something in print or whatever. So we're doing some kind of community engagement work, that sharing of work with others. So acting or whatever. But yeah, and I've always felt fortunate to be at UNI, where if I was at a Research One school, I think I'd have more of a story like what Brady was telling. Like, I would be, stay in your lane. Like, well, why are you writing this stuff on craft, on how to write, how crime writers write their stories? You've written several articles on craft, but what's that got to do with film? And why are you writing short stories and getting them published in these literary magazines? That's not what you were hired for. And so I feel very fortunate that I landed in the spot that I'm in, is what I'm trying to say. Even though right now in Iowa, there's this whole anti-DEI thing going on, and we have to disguise what we do with using different words, so that when people start doing searches, because in my courses, I teach all kinds of diverse stuff. I just don't say the word diversity, because I don't want those bozos, checking out what I'm doing. So state-wise, it's a tough time right now in Iowa. And there's a lot of teachers, especially at secondary school level, that aren't willing to push the envelope because they could lose their jobs. And so for us professors, there's a way in which we can dance around it by using coded words that we hope people up above, I don't mean administrators, but I mean like Board of Regents peoples and state legislature people can't decode. It's like being Gramsci. It's weird right now. So I feel I live in a pretty restrictive state, but I feel that the university environment has given me a ton of freedom. So it's this weird paradox, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that I think in my mind might be the stuff of maybe another episode to because that's a complex issue that you're bringing up there, and I've got a lot of things I'd like to say about it. But maybe in the interest of time and the fact I have a 5-year-old at home waiting for me to take him to McDonald's, we should shift gears to our featured story. So I don't want to cut you off, Brady. Did you have anything you wanted to add about anything Grant had said there before we jump into our featured story?
Well, yeah, I will. I think we should absolutely have a conversation, perhaps even in our next podcast, about the bigger environment that surrounds us as scholars and writers, people who are interested in free expression, free thought, who don't want to be pinned in a lane. I mean, I'm teaching a capstone seminar for our lit majors in the spring on book banning in America. And, states are now publishing lists of books that they will not allow faculty to have in their libraries. We live in repressive times, and people are coming for our freedom of speech and for our ability to pursue our art, and for writers to work and to say and think the things that we want and not to be restricted. So yeah, I'm sorry, I'm
love it, brother.
Ranting, but yeah, we should come back to this.
Yeah, no, absolutely, because I think that's a great topic, and like I said, I've got lots of stuff I'd like to that maybe is going to be the next 3 podcast episodes. I don't know, but yeah, our loyal viewers and listeners know that we have a featured story each episode, and this episode we are taking a look at a story out of the most recent Boulevard. I know we've done Boulevard stuff before, but this one landed, in my mailbox pretty recently and had just filled with great stuff. There's an excerpt from Joyce Carol Oates's forthcoming novel Butcher, which is really terrific. And I thought about maybe we could look at that, but Joyce Carol Oates, she probably gets enough press. So instead, we're going to talk about a story called Night Watch by Matthew Goldberg. And I'll say more about Matthew in just a few minutes here, but I noticed looking at his bio that Grant had published him in 2008. He appeared in North American Review with a story called Flight. He has a nice long list of really juicy pub credits, and one of them is North American Review. So good for you, Matthew Goldberg. So I'll just kind of start off, just kind of give a sense of what this is about, and then I see what you guys have to say about Night Watch by Matthew Goldberg. And again, this is Boulevard, winter 2024, so very, very recent. And it begins. When I meet people out of state, I say I'm from DC, not Rockville. I'm not from just outside DC either, like others say they're from just outside Boston or just outside New York. I don't diagram the pinched U of the Metro's Red Line and its northernmost Maryland tips. And of course, I don't mention the body. I simply say DC, 2 letters disconnected from place, 2 ascending notes, and I wait for others to strike the next notes in their heads. In my suburb, like all others, mysteries hid inside 2-car garages and red brick houses, inside the spaces between work and sleep. Beginning in 9th grade, I volunteered to walk the dog after dinner so I could trespass Cold Spring Park, residents only, closed at dark, it says in parentheses, where a deep man-made pond hid minnows and sunfish. Geese splashed in the pond, the males biting the females' necks, forcing them underwater. The wide backs of houses ringed the park's asphalt walking trails. The back lawns sloped down, exposing the basement's windows and sliding glass doors. And there, in the dark, I gripped the top planks of wood fences and toggled my binoculars to invade my neighbors' houses. That's how the story begins. So much of the story is about what the main character, Gabe is his name, what he kind of, window peeps, peeping Tom-esque, what he sees his neighbors doing at night in their homes and describing that. And of course, it's, some of it's kind of mundane and some of it's not mundane. And then I know we always hate to know, to give too much away, but I think we just need to say that eventually a body is found. He finds a body, a murdered girl, a murdered young woman, and that then propels the narrative in other directions. And we can get into more detail about that or less detail or something. But let me just stop there with my own yammerings and turn it over to you guys. And maybe, Grant, I'll go to you since you are a former publisher of Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really well-written story, wonderful sentences, and what a hook at the beginning, the body, which establishes, so that I think that's in the first paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
And then we transition to a second paragraph, and there's something in American letters. Jeremy Schraffenberger and I had a talk about this, about 6 months ago. These stories that are framed, or maybe not frame's the right word, but that has a very important scene, almost like a primal scene of a character either walking through a small town or a city and imagining what's going on in all those homes around them. And I see it again and again. And this story has that, except, we're going to Cornell Woolrich territory here. We got a little rear window action happening with the binoculars and that thing about being a curious kid who, there's references to vasectomy, not quite understanding what that is, and a reference to a hickey and how it's vampiric. So there's that whole negotiating of the sexual self that's starting to emerge, because the kid's around ninth grade, I think, at the time of the story. But there's a story I read by Fred Chappell, which has a kid walking through a town and wondering what kind of wild, crazy things are going on in the windows all around him. So that dark underbelly to that veneer, like the kind of stuff David Lynch explores, suburbia, that underneath all of this are troubled lives and violence in homes and all that kind of stuff. So to me, that's very American. And I love that. I love that at the beginning. So I'm going to stop now, let some other people jump in here, but I have lots of other things to say, but I think that was a gorgeous way to begin it. And I also think it's very much with these sort of literary stories where you establish right from the beginning the musicology of this piece. This is a guy, the way he's talking about DC, and we find out as we go on, he knows a lot about violin playing and getting two-note action. And then he's a pianist, and we find that out, and he played in front of Nordstrom's. So it's like it's all layered in a wonderful way. But the opening establishes that just with the use of the DC thing, and then establishes the body, which creates this whole undercurrent of blackness. By blackness, I mean death, dark, the black creep of death. That foreshadows the whole story. So I don't think you were giving anything away, Ted, when you mentioned he tells us about it right in the very opening. So
Right,
anyway,
right.
enough for me. Let's hear from Brady. What do you got to say?
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, it's what you're saying, Grant, strikes me is all exactly right. I mean, this is a very well written story. This is a writer who really has control of their material, but it's such a creepy story. It's such an upsetting story. And it is about the American mundane, the suburbs, wealth. Like all these folks are very well off, like they're professional people, they're white collar people. They have these big homes and these, really exclusive neighborhoods. And yet it's about those experiences, about this young guy sort of growing up and some transformative experiences, but it's also about this like hyper sexualized predatory space where the targets of the predation are primarily girls and young women. And so it's this really dark portrait of American life. And our narrator, of course, we're seeing things through the narrator. So there's already we sort of have a preset or a natural sympathy for the point of view of the narrator. Like we're walking there with them. We're seeing the world through their eyes. We're going to see what's going on through them, and so we have this affinity for them. But this guy's really upsetting. Like this guy is really creepy, and yeah, how much of that predatory nature, it's ambiguous, that he shares with the world that he inhabits. Yeah, this one was a hard read. So thank you, Ted. so, I had a upsetting hour or so, and I didn't go back to, contrary to my practice, I didn't go back to reread it. The story bothered me too much to look at it again. At the same time, this is not criticism of the writer. The writer, it seems to me, is very accomplished in what they're doing. Goldberg has really, has really done a fine job. It's just that it's awful.
Right. Well, one of the things I find really interesting about the story, one of many things, is it seems to always be teetering on the edge of being a certain kind of story, and then it doesn't go there.
Yeah.
It could be a sort of almost like John Cheever, looking at the underbelly of suburbia, kind of like Grant alluded to a little bit ago, but then we don't quite go there. And we've obviously got this body, and so then there's a sense of this. It's going to be a mystery, trying to figure out, who killed this young woman, who's like an au pair, kind of like in one of the homes there. So we're kind of introduced to her, before the murder, so we have some sense of her. But anyway, there are several kinds of mysteries, or it could be kind of a sexual awakening kind of story at one point. There's the teenage parties that are a lot of like, close dancing and necking and so there's some of that going on, but it's always kind of on the brink of being one of these kinds of stories, but then it kind of veers off into something else. And so I think that might sort of add a bit to the sense of unease, because we never really feel completely grounded in what kind of story this is. And the fact that it's a reflective narrator, and he seems to have a lot of insight into other people's personalities, but yet is kind of oblivious to his own motivations and what he's up to. So again, there's just a lot of complexities going on here. I don't know, Grant, I'll kick it back to you. What are some of your further thoughts?
I totally agree. And I loved what you guys both are saying, but especially Brady, what you had to say about the sort of vibe of the story. Because for me, one of the things that I was frustrated with on a first read is I think there's always a danger when we do hybrid forms. So it's literary fiction, and it's very much like a Cheever story. I don't mean to be denigrating in that way, because I love Cheever. I think he's a great writer. And it has that kind of resonance at the end. I'm not going to give away the ending, but there's a way in which it builds. In the last two paragraphs, you can feel the writer climbing the ladder of rhetoric and using imagery to have this kind of resounding crescendo effect, which is very much a literary story. But there was a part of me as a crime writer that wanted more crime and less literary flourishes. And then on a second read, I'm very much in league with what Brady was saying. I realized that syntactically, this is a crime story to a certain degree. It is a story of violence towards women, which is a big part of crime. Even the description of the fish biting the other fish's neck, and then when they kiss, he makes her lips bleed, and then the woman whose face is bashed in. And all the stuff that's good, the relationship that's breaking up, the affairs that are happening. There's violence everywhere in this piece. So I think it's a literary story that does have syntactical elements of crime noir. And I think that's one of the things I really like, that balancing act. Like when I read it a second time, I was really enamored with that. First time I was like, I want this instead of this. And then the second time, it's like, oh, I get it now. And it's very uncomfortable. I totally agree, Brady, with your response. But that was also part of the appeal to me as someone who likes the dark world of crime, was that there's this complicated narrator, and the whole world is, ugh, it's powerful stuff. And I think the writer, I think Goldberg does a great job of combining the two genres of, well, I know you mentioned a lot of other genres, Ted, but I'm just going to say literary fiction and crime fiction. And I think he does a nice balancing dance between those two. And the vibe I get at the end is very much one of having gone through a Pyrrhic journey. I feel a little dead after reading this story. Whereas the narrator is almost more like a Jim Thompson character. And in Jim Thompson's crime fiction, there's a lot of times where I don't want to say a narrator is unreliable, but there's perceptions that the narrator has that creates a distance in me from the experiences that he's sharing. And I think that's a strength of the story.
Yeah, you're mentioning of the male gaze, and again, the title of the story is Night Watch, and I want to talk a little bit more about the origin of that title in just a couple minutes. But it's literally about the male gaze. I mean, Gabe is gazing in these people's windows, but very specifically looking at females, whether it's adult females who are undressed, and he's watching them in their homes, or there's this a young woman his age named May, who's very, of Asian descent, and very, very introverted and shy, but yet he is constantly checking her out. And then there's other people, and the woman who gets murdered rather is again from another. She's from Amsterdam, and her name is Sana, I guess, and she is very much an object of fascination and fantasizing these young men, certainly, but one imagines the older men. In that regard, this story very much, I was reminded of Cheever, but I also was reminded of one of my other favorite writers and favorite stories, and that's Robert Coover's The Babysitter. And The Babysitter is this classic short story. It's a series of vignettes, and it's all about this teenage girl who's babysitting, obviously, but it's about different people's perceptions of her, and imagining what she's doing or what they'd like to be doing with her. And there's episodes where violence is imagined, and there's episodes where tenderness is imagined, and so this idea of fixating on the female form as an object of desire, but not as like a real human being with real personality and agency and all those kinds of things. I don't know, Brady, I'll kick it back over to you. Do you have any thoughts either on that whole idea of the male gaze and perception, or just anything else you'd like to say about the story?
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you mentioned Coover and The Babysitter. I mean, it's that portrait of suburbia. I mean, it's a Borgesian story in that it's a forking path story. So everything is happening, the possibilities. Yeah, and Ted, you're mentioning earlier of the genres, and Grant too. It's also a serial killer story, right? It's not, crime. Maybe I'm getting too specific, telling too much about the story, but Grant's, right. It's like, it's a crime story. But then, yeah, the Thompson character, the narrator, that, like, we don't want to be with that mind. We don't want to be occupying that gaze. It is repellent, right? Like, stop being so damn creepy. Stop skulking around. Stop with the stop. Everybody stop with the violence. In the last few days, been, a faithful reader, have been for many years, a faithful reader in New York Times, but reading in particular about the war in Ukraine, or the strikes in Gaza, or the civil war in the Sudan. And so this, this omnipresence of violence and predation, and then even in the most affluent of places, the same predation, the same awfulness presides. And so, I'm saying the same thing again, in virtually identical terms. It's just so damn upsetting. Yeah. So again, thanks, Ted.
Let me,
Yeah.
before I forget to, let me say a little bit more about our author, Matthew Goldberg. This is from the contributor's note, and it says Matthew Goldberg's story Night Watch is the title story of his forthcoming debut collection, which won the Spokane Prize for short fiction and will be published by Willow Springs Books. His stories have appeared in The Atlantic, Shenandoah American Short Fiction, North American Review, among others. He received an individual artist fellowship from the Arkansas Arts Council and a special mention for a pushcart prize. He lives in Missouri with his wife, their son, and their long-eared dog. And I don't think he has a website, not one that I could find, but he's a professor, and so he has a kind of a bio on his university's webpage and list of credits and so forth. His bachelor's is he has an MFA, but his bachelor's is actually in the sciences, which is kind of an interesting background. A lot of writers have that. Vonnegut was an anthropologist, and obviously those kinds of things. And like I said, other list of really impressive writing credits. Matthew with one T. There's another writer, Matthew Goldberg, with two T's, which so that's easy to get confused out there. But really, really interesting stuff. This we're getting to a point in our podcast where we're becoming self-referential, and this story reminded me in many ways of the first featured story we did way back when, episode 1, Laura Schmidt's story Runaway Nation, which is about a bunch of young girls, and there's again murders happening in their suburban home. And so that story isn't so much about the murders as it is about the impact of the murders on these young girls. And then another story that we looked at in particular, if I can find it here, we looked at a story called Mythology by She Siegel. And we looked in particular at her use of illusions, because I think this story is just really fascinating when it comes to illusions. You've got all the musical illusions that Grant kind of mentioned a little bit before, but the title Night Watch obviously has a literal sense because the main character watches all these people at night. But it's also he lets us know he eventually in adulthood he goes to Amsterdam, which again is the home country of the young woman who was killed, and goes to the museum, the Rijksmuseum, I think it's pronounced, and sees a painting, looks at a painting and describes a painting. Sorry. I have notes here if I can find them. But okay, the Night Watch, and it says it occupies a tremendous space at the Rijksmuseum, and it's by Rembrandt from 1642, and it's a really interesting. It's a huge painting, and it's a painting of a group that's going to go shooting. So they've got their muskets and all this stuff. This group of men, who are going to go shooting. So there's this element of violence, that is the focal point or the main thing going on in this narrative painting. But it's interesting because it's a darkened scene, even though it isn't actually taking place at night. It's inside somewhere, but there's like a beam of light coming through a window, and it's shining on a young girl. So you've got these sort of darkened male figures with their weapons, but then you've got this focal point of this young girl amidst this crowd of men and so forth. Obviously, there's a lot going on there in terms of connections between the painting and what's going on in the story and so forth. And then he also mentions, Matthew does, another. He kind of alludes to a painting of a girl in a kimono, and I think he doesn't tell us, but I think he's referencing "Girl in a White Kimono" by George Hendrik Breitner from 1894, because the girl from Amsterdam wears a kimono, I think, at one point, and he talks about this painting of this girl who's clearly European, but she's wearing this Japanese kimono. And so there's this idea, I think, of appearance versus reality, and just all kinds of interesting things going on there. So did you guys take note of the illusions, and did you do much with them in your limited time you had to read this story and prepare to talk about it? Grant, did you do much with the illusions in this story in terms of your own interpretation of it?
I loved what you just shared, because I love the art of ekphrasis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But I mean, I've written a story based on a Hopper painting that I found inspiring, and I wrote a whole crime story just based on the painting, and it's a poetic tradition, but there's no reason fiction writers can't do it too. So I think it's really cool that you're pointing out, and it ties into everything Brady was saying. You got guys with guns, the gaze on a young girl. There's a thing about just I know the character's ninth grader as he's explaining this stuff, but there is a kind of looking not just at adults but underage people too, minors, that he's viewing through the binoculars, which can be kind of creepy, to say the least. Fortunately, he's maybe 14 or 15, but still, it makes me uncomfortable. So anyway, yeah, that's fascinating, Ted. Appreciate that.
Brady, any thoughts on any of that? Fellow painter?
Oh, well, yeah, Rembrandt's The Night Watch. When you walk in the room, it's so immense. It's such an epic painting. And Ted, correct me if I'm wrong, but the men in the image are affluent. They are kind of dandies, and they have, groovy beards and mustaches, and and Rembrandt has that way of capturing opulence and elegance. And yeah, so it's about wealth and power and predation. Yeah, it looks great. It's visually stunning. Unlike the Mona Lisa, which is about this big, right? And you can't even get close to it in the Louvre because there's so many people crowding around. Yeah, at the Rijksmuseum, you can actually, stand back and try to take it all in. Yeah, so the writer here, I mean, effective use of allusions to paintings, but also to musicians, to Bach, to what we call classical music. Yeah, there's a lot going on in just these very few short pages. There's an atomic weight to this overall story, and that contrast between this high art and the miserableness of what's going on, adds that much more punch, I think, to the story.
And the title too takes us back to the world of noir. How can I not hear the word night and not think about crime noir, right? I mean, there's a movie called Night Watch with Liz Taylor, which is kind of a crime film with Lawrence Harvey. There's there's a William P. McGivern novel that's got night in the title, might be Night Editor, Night something. It's about newspaper business and crime. So when I hear night, it just it resonates with me, criminal undertow. So he's got a lot going on there, with that allusion to the painting, but also just the very title and the gaze, of course, that he's chosen.
I always pronounce it ekphrasis. I'm not sure that's right either, Grant. But I had this little sci-fi dystopian story published a couple months ago called In Our Time, and it plays with the Hemingway short story collection. But in the story, this is set some distant time in the future, and the main character finds an antique, ancient book, and it just happens to be Hemingway's In Our Time. And I say it's a frontispiece, but actually I've got a copy that this is the cover of the book. But it's a bullfighting scene, which to this character is completely foreign because we're now living in a time when there isn't such a thing as bullfighting, and it's an abstract concept. So anyway, in this little story, I spent a bunch of time describing this bullfighting scene, which is actually the cover of the book. I don't know if I should give credit where credit is due there, but anyway, so it's a pretty short story, but a big chunk of it is just this ekphristic, exercise where I'm describing the bullfighting, and it injects all this drama and tension into the story, which is otherwise a pretty quiet story. So a lot of the tension comes from the description of this artwork. And then just a couple mornings ago, I'm working on this new novel, which the main character is I'm playing with kind of Edgar Allan Poe inspired character. And he goes into this room and meets these people, but there's this mural on the wall. And I wanted it to be a mural that has resonance with what's going on in the novel as a whole, in this part of the novel. And so I decided I want the mural to be of either a biblical scene or a mythological scene. And so I spent like a couple of hours, a couple mornings ago, just going through different biblical stories, mythological stories, until I found one that seemed to resonate, with what was going on in the novel. And so then I describe a non-existent mural based on the narrative that I read in the Bible. And so there's just a lot of really interesting and fun things you can do when you incorporate art, into your descriptions and so forth. Now, Brady, what are some of your thoughts on including artwork, illusions, that kind of thing?
Oh, well, yeah, it adds depth, it gives reference, it tell us, you have a narrow work on the page, you got a few pages, but then you make those references, allusions, bring in all those works. T.S. Eliot's a master at that, right? Like The Wasteland is a encyclopedia, compendium of great Western writing, and the ekphrasis, the novella in The Term Between that closes the collection turns on the description of a sculpture of this massive, grotesque, distended, broken up kind of individual. Yeah, so I find real power in that. And then, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about allusions and plays on language and references. Yeah, they add so much, complexity and depth, and it's kind of a stock and trade for us, I think. Like, we got to do it.
Right.
Like Grant was saying the other day, right? Praise from a film or praise from a story, right? They stick with us and they become part of our own storytelling.
Yeah.
What did you say, Grant? The lake, the well, the
Yeah,
ocean.
from Chandler, opened at my feet and I fell in. I think I used something exactly like that from Farewell My Lovely. I'm right now reading one of my favorite writers, Dash Hammett.
Law.
Oh yeah, the Continental Op. I love this guy because he's fat, like me. It's wonderful. Like seeing heroes that don't look like they have personal trainers. And so there's a story where he ends, and I shared this slide with a guy, shared again. It's a great moment. He says, and somebody's going to swing for a murder they didn't do for one they didn't do, but the one that they did do, they got away with, but the one they didn't do, they're going to swing for. And then the last line is, and he did. And those three little words, I have used those to end chapters, like a nice little punctuation mark. And I got that from Hammett. So yeah, I love doing that kind of thing. I do want to mention one thing. I don't know what you guys think of this, but I've been, thinking about the gaze and the idea of art and predation. But it's interesting in the story that the character makes a comment about May. I don't know if he's talking to Chuck, Charles, Charlie. He goes by all three, or people name him all three. But he says he didn't kiss her because or maybe it's an inner monologue, but that would ruin everything, which I think's inner. So like she's like a muse or something. He listens something about the music she plays. He's like an art object that inspires him with maybe his 88 keys activity. I don't know, but there's something different about the way she gets objectified in a kind of beauty way versus watching a woman touch her breast to see if she has breast cancer, watching somebody go down on somebody, watching, all these other images of discomfort. It's a different kind of gaze. I don't know what you guys make of that, but it really stood out to me as a kind of a misfit detail that I really thought was cool.
Mm-hmm. Brady, thoughts on that?
Oh, well, yeah, no, Grant, I agree. I mean, he thinks of May in different terms, but there's something still dehumanizing, I find, about it. Like, where's his effort to see her or to hear her? I mean, he hears the music, but is he trying to understand her experience? Is he sympathetic towards her at all? I mean, I agree it is different, but I don't know if it becomes more human at all. So I mean, yeah, I'm still creeped out.
Well, I think one of the things that Matthew may be doing is playing a little bit with culture and cultural expectations, and the fact that May, comes from a culture that maybe is more introverted in terms of displaying sexuality, et cetera, versus the young woman from Amsterdam, who's feels fine walking around in a kimono around a bunch of teenage kids or whatever. And so I think that's another, again, it's a shortish short story, and yet it's got the impact of a novel in terms of all the different things that are going on and things that can make us think about and so forth. So yeah, great, a great story. I'm just gonna Boulevard Winter 2024. Besides the Joyce Carol Oates excerpt, there's a bunch of great stuff in here. So I'm maybe wrapping this up. Let me kick it back one more time just for kind of final thoughts, and then we'll call it an episode. Grant, do you have some sort of concluding thoughts here before we hit the stop record button?
No, not really. I really like the story, and I respect where Brady's coming from, but my feeling's always been that if art disturbs you, that can be a good thing, because it certainly gets me thinking about issues of social justice and how women are treated. I don't want to sound like a girl dad or whatever, because I get so tired of these buzzwords that get out there, but I was always aware of that kind of thing, that when my girls were going through puberty and becoming young women, just how difficult it was to navigate. It's different than being a boy. Like I had a rough time too. There's all this masculinity crap that you have to live up to, but for girls, they're constantly the object of the gaze, other boys. And if you have a big chest, they're staring at your shirt. It's just like, guys whispering in my daughter Elizabeth's ear, obscene things in class, and the teacher not hearing it or being aware of it. My daughter not having the courage or to step up and say something, because you don't know how to react. You didn't even tell us about it till years later. But that's the kind of shit that women and girls have to deal with. So I appreciated the artistry of the story, but also the discomfort I had reading it, because it makes me want to fight for change, to change these conditions that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, well said. Yeah, Brady.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, no, I agree, Grant, and we have daughters, so we know. I'll change the direction, since Ted, you asked for a summation. I mean, I think taking a step back and looking at some of the course of our conversation, we were talking about how things are set out on the page and what kinds of things we can do, and in a way, and then talking about the story and the allusions and the music, and the other stories that are sort of brought to mind by the setting and the particular descriptions of suburbia. I think one of the subjects we've been exploring without naming it is forms of complexity.
Mm.
And the kind of richness that we want to try to achieve by various means. And I think, there's a word I sometimes hear, and I find it very discouraging. People call things confusing, but I don't think they are. I think what you're getting is challenged by, and sometimes by, complexity, by not spelling things out, by putting some pressure on the reader. And so I think complexity, not for its own end, but as part of the narrative, it can be something that's really great, and that's something that's very compelling, but which does not finally matter a whit compared to the points that Grant's making about the kind of world we live in.
Right. Yeah, no, that's also well said. That spurred my final thought. My high school students used to always accuse me of overthinking, the stories we were talking about. And I'm like, no, we're not overthinking. We're actually just thinking. You're just not used to it. So it seems like overthinking, that kind of thing. So anyway, well, thanks guys. I really, really enjoyed it. And I appreciate our listeners and viewers. And I'm sure we'll be back together in a month or so for our next episode. I'll go ahead and hit stop record.